John Matthews stood at the edge of the marble walkway, his shoes shining so brightly that they caught the morning light. The air at Arlington National Cemetery was calm, almost silent except for the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. John had walked this path hundreds of times before, not as a visitor, but as a tomb guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier. It had been years since he wore that uniform, but even now, every step he took felt guided by the discipline that had shaped his soul. John was not just any soldier. He was a man who had lived by a simple rule: duty before self. From the first day he joined the army, he understood that being a soldier meant more than carrying a weapon. It meant carrying values, respect, honor, and silence. As a tomb guard, he had learned to stand for hours in harsh rain, cold and blazing heat without flinching, speaking or showing emotion. It wasn't easy, but it was sacred. The tomb represented all the soldiers who never returned home, the nameless heroes who gave everything for their country. Guarding it was not just a job, it was a promise. He remembered the first day he stood watch. The sergeant had told him, "When you take those steps, remember, you're not walking for yourself. You're walking for those who can't." Those words had stayed with him forever. After completing his years of service at the tomb, John was sent overseas. The war zone was nothing like the calm marble paths of Arlington. There were loud noises, sleepless nights, and moments when every breath felt uncertain, but John did not let fear control him. He became known among his unit as the man who always ran toward danger to help others. His courage and leadership during a rescue mission changed many lives. He pulled 2 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy fire and refused to leave the battlefield until everyone was accounted for. That act of bravery earned him the Medal of Honor, the highest award a soldier could receive. When the medal was placed around his neck by the president, John didn't smile. Instead, he looked down and thought about his friends who hadn't made it home. He felt that the medal didn't belong only to him, it belonged to them too. He told the reporters afterward, "This isn't a medal for me. It's a reminder of the people who gave everything. I just carried them home." Years passed and John retired from active service. He returned to his small hometown where he lived a quiet life. People often saw him helping at the local veterans center or visiting schools to talk to children about respect, courage, and kindness. He never boasted about his achievements. Most people who met him didn't even know he was a Medal of Honor recipient until they saw the framed photograph in the local museum. Every Memorial Day and Veterans Day, John would put on his neatly pressed uniform, polish his shoes, and attend the remembrance ceremonies. He didn't go there for attention. He went there because it was his way of keeping the memory of fallen soldiers alive. When he wore his Medal of Honor, he did it not to show pride, but to honor the names that no one remembered. The medal wasn't a decoration to him. It was a story, a silent message that said, "We still remember." People admired him quietly. The younger soldiers respected him deeply. When John walked into a room, the conversation slowed. There was something about his presence, calm, yet strong, that made others feel they were in the company of a man who had truly lived by his duty. Yet, behind that calm face, John carried many memories that were heavy. Sometimes at night he would sit on his porch, look at the stars, and whisper a few words that only he could hear. He didn't talk much about the past because he believed that some memories were meant to stay between a soldier and the sky. Life went on peacefully until one year, when John was invited to a special veterans event at a city courthouse. It was supposed to be a day of honor, where local heroes were recognized for their service. John attended wearing his uniform and medal, just as he had done for many years. He stood quietly among other veterans, shaking hands, smiling politely, and listening to speeches about sacrifice and courage. But in that crowd was someone who would soon challenge everything he stood for: Judge Edward Harland. The judge was known for his strictness and pride in following rules to the letter. When he saw John wearing the Medal of Honor at the event, he frowned slightly, not out of jealousy, but out of cold misunderstanding. To him, the courtroom had rules, and so did ceremonies. He believed that only active military officers were permitted to wear certain medals and uniform during public functions. Without fully understanding the meaning behind John's actions, the judge saw it as a violation of protocol. After the event ended, the judge approached John with a firm expression. "Mr. Matthews," he said, "I respect your service. But next time, You should refrain from wearing military decorations during civilian events unless officially permitted. John looked at him, calm as ever. Sir, he replied softly, I wear this not for myself but for those who didn't return. It's not a display, it's remembrance. The judge didn't respond. He just nodded and walked away. But the matter didn't end there. A few weeks later, John received an official notice. He was being summoned to a hearing regarding the unauthorized wearing of military insignia. The judge had filed the complaint himself. When John read the notice, he felt a strange sadness rather than anger. He couldn't believe that honoring his fallen brothers had turned into a legal issue. He placed the letter down and looked at his Medal of Honor resting inside its case. The medal had once been given to him with gratitude and respect. Now someone wanted to take away his right to wear it. But John wasn't a man who fought with words or bitterness. He believed in patience and dignity. He decided that if the law wanted to question his honor, then he would stand there silently, just as he had done so many years ago at the tomb, guarding in silence for the unknown soldier. He knew the truth. Real honor could not be removed by anyone. On the morning of the hearing, John dressed carefully. His uniform fit him perfectly and his shoes were polished just like the old days. He stood before the mirror, looked at the medal once more and whispered, This isn't just mine. This belongs to every man who didn't come home. Then he left for the courthouse, calm and steady, unaware that what was about to happen would not only test his patience, but also awaken an entire nation to what true respect really means. As he walked up the courthouse steps, people noticed him. Some recognized his face from the news. Others simply felt his quiet strength. There was no anger in his eyes, only peace, the kind that comes from a lifetime of service. In that moment, John Matthews didn't look like a man facing judgment. He looked like a soldier walking once more to stand guard, not for a tomb this time, but for the truth of honor itself. The courthouse was quiet that morning. People were moving around with files in their hands, whispering softly as the big clock ticked on the wall. John Matthews sat in the hallway waiting for his name to be called. He had been in many places where silence meant something deep. The quiet of the tomb of the unknown soldier, the silence before a mission, and now this silence before a courtroom hearing. But this time it felt different. This silence carried judgment, not respect. He wasn't nervous. His hands were steady, resting on his lap, his eyes calm. But inside, his heart was heavy. He could not understand how wearing a medal, a symbol of sacrifice and honor, had become a matter for the court. It was something that went beyond rules and paperwork. It was about the meaning behind the medal, not the medal itself. When the clerk called his name, John stood and walked into the courtroom. His steps were slow and firm, just like when he used to march in front of the tomb. Every step echoed across the room. People sitting inside turned their heads. Some recognized him from the local news. Others had come out of curiosity. On one side of the room sat a few veterans from his town, quietly watching, their faces serious and full of quiet support. At the front, behind the high wooden desk, sat Judge Edward Harland, the man who had filed the complaint. He looked up as John entered, his expression firm and unreadable. The judge had spent years in that chair, making decisions about laws, rules, and justice. But that day he was facing something deeper, something that couldn't be measured by written codes. Mr. John Matthews, the judge said, adjusting his glasses, you are here today because of a violation concerning military uniform protocol and the public display of honors during non-military events. John nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor. The courtroom was silent. The judge continued, according to regulation, military decorations are to be worn in specific circumstances under certain guidelines. You attended a civic event, not a military one, and wore your Medal of Honor without prior authorization. John listened carefully, never interrupting. His eyes didn't show anger or resistance. He was simply listening as he had been trained to do all his life, to listen before speaking. When the judge finished, John spoke in his calm, steady voice. Your Honor, I understand the rules, but I did not wear this medal for pride or for display. I wore it because it belongs to those who can't be here to wear it themselves. I stand for them, sir. The judge frowned slightly. Intentions, while respected, cannot excuse the violation of procedure. Rules are what keep institutions respectful and organized. John paused for a moment. Then he said softly, Rules do matter, sir, but so does meaning. This medal is not decoration, it is remembrance. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that everyone in the room could feel. Even people who didn't fully understand the military felt the sincerity behind them. The judge cleared his throat. "We are not here to question your service, Mr. Matthews. You have our respect for that. But rules must be followed by everyone, no matter who they are." John simply nodded again. "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom stayed silent for a long time. The judge looked down at his papers, avoiding John's eyes. There was something about the veteran's calmness that unsettled him. He had faced many angry people in his courtroom, but never someone so peaceful in the face of judgment. After a few moments, the judge said, "You are hereby instructed to refrain from wearing your Medal of Honor at any future civilian or public non-military events. This is an official order." The words echoed through the room. Some people gasped quietly. A few veterans in the audience shook their heads in disbelief. John stood still, his posture straight, his face expressionless. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply said, "Understood, Your Honor." The judge nodded quickly, almost as if he wanted to end the matter fast. "This hearing is concluded," he said, tapping the gavel. John turned and walked out of the courtroom. His shoes clicked softly against the floor. Outside, a few people tried to speak to him. Reporters, veterans, even a few strangers who had come to support him. But John only smiled faintly and said, "Thank you," before leaving quietly. He walked down the courthouse steps the same way he had walked in, calm and dignified. The sun was shining brightly now. For a moment he stopped, looking up at the sky. He didn't feel anger, but there was a deep sadness inside him. He thought about the soldiers whose names were lost to history, the ones whose families never got a chance to see them again. He had worn the medal for them, and now someone was asking him to take it off. That evening, John went home and placed the medal back in its wooden case. He ran his fingers gently over the glass cover. He didn't cry or sigh. He just whispered, "You'll always be worn, even if not on my chest." To him, the real honor wasn't in wearing the medal. It was in living by what it stood for. But outside the walls of his quiet home, the story began to spread. A local reporter who had attended the hearing wrote an article about the veteran who was ordered by a judge to remove his Medal of Honor. The headline caught everyone's attention. People started sharing it on social media, and soon it spread beyond the town, reaching veterans groups, news stations, and online forums across the country. The next day, John's phone began ringing. Friends, fellow soldiers, and even strangers called to show support. Some were angry, some were heartbroken, but all were proud of him. Veterans organizations issued public statements, calling the judge's action disrespectful to the spirit of service. Television reporters stood outside John's small house, waiting to get his comment. But John stayed quiet, refusing interviews. He told one reporter gently, "I've said all I needed to say in court." The judge, meanwhile, started facing questions from the public. Emails poured into his office. Many of them came from families of soldiers, expressing disappointment. The courthouse received calls from people demanding that the order be reversed. The judge had wanted to uphold rules, but he had unintentionally touched something sacred, the heart of a nation's respect for its heroes. In his quiet way, John continued his daily life. He still went to the Veterans Center, helped organize care packages for soldiers overseas, and spent time talking to children at the local school. When asked by a student why he didn't wear his medal anymore, John smiled and said, "Because real honor lives in what you do, not what you wear." Each evening he would walk in his backyard and think about how something so small, one person's misunderstanding, could become a national conversation about what true respect means. He didn't blame the judge. He only hoped that one day the man would understand. The case that had started as a simple courtroom rule was now turning into something much bigger. Across the country, people were beginning to see that sometimes the letter of the law can miss the spirit of what's right. And through it all, John Matthews remained the same, calm, respectful, and quietly strong. He didn't seek attention or sympathy. He only wanted people to remember the real reason he wore the medal, not for himself, but for the unknown soldier, for every name carved on stone, and for the silent promise that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. He didn't know it yet, but his quiet dignity was about to shake the very man who had judged him and remind the world that honor, once earned can never truly be taken away. The news spread faster than anyone expected. What started as a small courtroom hearing in a quiet town had now reached television screens and newspapers across the country. The headline read, "Judge orders veteran to remove his Medal of Honor." People could hardly believe it. How could a man who had risked his life for his country be told not to wear the medal that symbolized his bravery and sacrifice? It didn't make sense to them. To many, it felt like a disrespect not just to John Matthews, but to every soldier who had ever worn a uniform. Within days, the story became a topic of discussion everywhere, in homes, schools, coffee shops, and offices. Radio shows debated it, TV anchors interviewed veterans, and social media was filled with messages of support for John. People began sharing old photos of their family members in uniform, writing messages like, "They deserve our respect." Not rules, John, however, stayed silent. He continued with his normal routine, helping at the Veterans Center, walking his dog in the evenings, and volunteering at the community park. He didn't read the newspapers or watch the interviews. His neighbors noticed that reporters often came to his door, but John politely declined every request for comment. He wasn't looking for attention. He just wanted peace. Meanwhile, veterans organizations began organizing peaceful gatherings in support of John. In many cities, veterans stood together in front of war memorials, wearing their medals proudly as a sign of unity. They carried banners that read, "Honor the honor, and you can't order respect away." Even people who had never served in the military joined these gatherings. Teachers brought students to learn about the meaning of service and sacrifice. Elderly veterans came in wheelchairs holding small flags in their hands. The air was filled with a quiet sense of unity, not anger but strength. One morning, John received a letter in the mail. It was from a young boy named Ethan, who had seen the story on television. The letter was written in simple, shaky handwriting. "Dear Mr. Matthews, my grandpa was a soldier too. He told me that medals are not just shiny things. They are stories. Thank you for showing what true honor means. You are my hero." John smiled softly as he read it. He placed the letter inside his medal case, right beside the Medal of Honor. For the first time since the hearing, he felt a warmth inside his heart. Maybe, he thought, this was the reason it had all happened, to remind people about the meaning of respect. As days passed, the pressure on Judge Edward Harland began to grow. Reporters followed him outside the courthouse, asking questions about his decision. "Do you regret your order, Judge?" one of them asked. The judge avoided eye contact and simply said, "I was following the law." But his voice was softer than usual, and his expression showed discomfort. At first, he had thought people would see his action as proper and lawful. He never expected that his ruling would hurt so many hearts or draw so much attention. Letters started arriving at his office, too. Hundreds of them. Some were angry, but many were simply heartfelt. Veterans wrote about how much their medals meant to them. Families shared stories of loved ones who never came home. One letter said, "You can make a law, sir, but you cannot make a soldier forget what he fought for." The judge read them in silence, one after another. Something inside him began to shift. For the first time, he started to see that maybe rules weren't always enough. Sometimes, understanding mattered more. Back in Johnstown, the local community decided to organize a small event at the park to show support for him. They called it a Day of Honor. Hundreds of people came, children, parents, veterans, and teachers. They brought flowers, flags, and handmade signs. Some people even wore small pins shaped like medals. When John arrived, he didn't expect such a large crowd. He was surprised and humbled. As he walked through the park, people clapped softly, some even saluting him. A little girl ran up to him and handed him a small paper medal she had made with gold paint and string. "This is for you," she said shyly. John bent down, smiled, and said, "Thank you, sweetheart. This means more than you know." The mayor of the town gave a short speech, saying, "Today we honor not just a man, but a message, and that true respect comes from the heart, not from a rule book." The crowd cheered gently, their eyes full of admiration. John was asked to say a few words. He hesitated at first, but then he stepped forward and took the microphone. His voice was calm, deep, and sincere. "I don't stand here to argue or to prove anyone wrong," he said. "I stand here for the people who can't, for the unknown soldier, for every man and woman who gave their life so we could live in peace. This medal is not mine alone. It belongs to them. I only wear it so the world remembers them too. The crowd fell silent, listening closely. Many people had tears in their eyes. When John finished speaking, the applause that followed wasn't loud. It was gentle, heartfelt, and long. That evening, the videos of his speech spread across the country. Within hours, millions had watched it online. His calm words touched hearts everywhere. People began sending donations to veterans' charities in his name. News anchors spoke about his humility, calling him a living reminder of real courage. At the same time, the public's focus turned more sharply toward Judge Harland. Television interviews replayed his earlier statements, contrasting them with John's peaceful response. The difference was clear. One spoke through rules, the other through heart. The judge began receiving visits from officials and letters from fellow judges advising him to reconsider his decision. Some of them warned him that his action was hurting the court's image. Others simply asked him to do the right thing. At night, when the courthouse was empty, Judge Harland sat in his office looking at an old photograph on his desk, a picture of his father in uniform. His father had been a World War II veteran. He remembered how proudly his father used to polish his medals before Memorial Day. The memory made the judge's eyes soften. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his decision had not been about respect. It had been about pride, about holding power instead of understanding meaning. Meanwhile, John continued to live quietly, unaware of the full extent of what was happening. People from across the country sent him cards, thank you letters, and even small medals made by children. His mailbox was full every morning. But John never acted like a hero. He would only say, "They're not thanking me. They're thanking everyone who served." In just a few weeks, the story that had started as one man's struggle had turned into something much larger, a national reminder of gratitude. It wasn't about medals anymore. It was about values, about remembering that honor could not be ordered, taken away, or silenced. And as more voices joined together in support, the world began to see John Matthews not as just a veteran in a small town, but as a symbol of quiet strength, a man who had faced judgment with calm dignity and, through his silence, had reminded a whole nation what real honor truly means. What John didn't know was that the story was far from over. In the days to come, the same judge who had ordered him to remove his medal would face consequences of his own, and the lesson would come back to him in a way he could never have imagined. The days after the public outcry were tense for Judge Edward Harland. He had expected people to accept his decision quietly, but instead the nation's eyes were on him. News crews filmed the courthouse every morning, and reporters asked questions that he struggled to answer. "Do you regret your order?" they would ask. "Do you see now the impact of your decision?" The judge avoided eye contact and muttered that he had followed the law, but inside he felt uneasy. Letters continued to arrive, filling his office and his mailbox at home. Families of veterans, retired soldiers, and even ordinary citizens shared their stories. One letter stood out. It was from a mother who had lost her son overseas. She wrote, "Your decision tells the world that rules matter more than lives. But medals are not just metal. They are memories, they are promises kept. Please reconsider." Reading it, the judge felt a twinge of guilt he could not ignore. Meanwhile, veterans organizations began holding more events in honor of John Matthews. Their goal was simple: to remind the public that honor, courage, and respect could not be dictated by rules alone. Thousands of people wrote petitions asking that the judge's order be reversed. News outlets broadcast interviews with John's fellow soldiers, who spoke about his bravery, his humility, and his lifelong dedication to service. Each interview seemed to strengthen public support for John and increase scrutiny on the judge. For Judge Harland, the pressure mounted quickly. Colleagues in the legal system began to speak privately. Some told him that his reputation was at risk. Others suggested that the Judicial Review Board might investigate him for using authority in a way that many considered unfair or disrespectful. The judge had never faced public scrutiny like this before. He had been proud of his ability to uphold rules and procedures. But now he realized that rules without understanding could appear harsh or even cruel. One morning, the judge received a formal notice. The Judicial Review Board had begun an official investigation into his actions regarding the order given to John Matthews. The board was responsible for ensuring that judges acted fairly, ethically, and in accordance with both law and principle. It was not a small matter. A negative review could threaten his career. The judge spent hours in his office, staring at the wooden walls and the photographs of previous cases. He thought about his father, who had served in the military, and how proud he had always been of those who wore their medals with dignity. He remembered attending a memorial ceremony with him as a boy, hearing stories of courage and sacrifice. The judge now felt the weight of what he had done. For the first time, he understood that rules alone could never capture the human meaning behind courage and honor. As the investigation proceeded, public attention only grew. News stories described the judge's order as a national embarrassment, and commentators discussed how the decision had undermined respect for military service. Citizens continued to write letters, many of them polite but firm, explaining that John Matthews had acted not out of pride, but out of remembrance and respect for those who had sacrificed everything. During this time, John Matthews remained calm, as always. He continued his volunteer work, attended local events, and quietly inspired people around him. He did not post messages online, he did not seek attention, and he did not publicly criticize the judge, but his silence spoke volumes. People began to compare his humility with the judge's stubbornness, and the contrast became a symbol of integrity versus authority without compassion. Veterans organizations decided to make the matter a teaching moment. They hosted workshops, school programs, and community discussions about the meaning of medals, honor, and remembrance. They invited young students to learn from John's example, to understand that courage often requires humility, patience, and selflessness. Children painted pictures of John's Medal of Honor, wrote letters to thank him, and even made small replicas as gifts. Each act reminded the judge and the public that the medal represented more than recognition. It represented the values the nation held dear. At home, Judge Harland could no longer ignore the weight of the situation. He received calls from colleagues, friends, and former military officers, all urging him to reconsider. Even his family urged him to reflect on the meaning of honor and respect. The judge found himself reading accounts of John Matthews' bravery in war, his calm demeanor at the courtroom, and the way he had inspired people across the country. The more he learned, the more he realized how his own actions had been lacking in understanding. One evening, alone in his office, he stared at the gavel before him. It had always symbolized power, authority, and law. But now, in the quiet of the room, it felt heavy and empty. He thought about the thousands of soldiers who had served, the families who had lost loved ones, and the man who had silently faced his judgment with dignity. A deep sense of regret filled him. For the first time, he realized that he had misused his authority in a way that went beyond legal rules. He had disrespected a lifetime of service. The investigation by the Judicial Review Board proceeded steadily. They gathered testimonies, reviewed the judge's statements, and examined the public impact of his order. Legal experts noted that while his actions were technically within his power, they had ignored the broader ethical and moral implications. They concluded that a judge must balance authority with empathy and understanding, especially when decisions touch on matters of honor and human values. Meanwhile, public support for John Matthews did not waver. People continued to attend events, write letters, and share his story online. Donations poured into veterans' charities in his name, and schools across the country taught lessons about courage, humility, and respect. The story had grown beyond a simple courtroom dispute. It had become a movement that reminded everyone that real honor could not be stripped away by any order or rule. Under mounting pressure, Judge Harland began to consider his options. He could continue to defend his decision and risk further criticism, or he could acknowledge the mistake and restore respect to the veteran he had challenged. He spent hours reflecting, thinking about the people who had written letters, the children who admired John, and the veterans whose trust had been shaken. Slowly, he began to understand that true leadership sometimes required humility, the courage to admit an error and take responsibility. Finally, after days of contemplation, the judge took action. He submitted a statement to the Judicial Review Board, acknowledging that his order had caused unnecessary harm and that it had failed to respect the true meaning of military service and honor. He requested that the order be reconsidered and that John Matthews be allowed to wear his Medal of Honor freely in public events. The announcement was met with widespread approval. Veterans, families, and citizens applauded the decision. Media outlets covered the story. emphasizing the judge's acknowledgement of error and the importance of empathy and understanding in positions of authority. While the judge's reputation had been challenged, many respected him for eventually taking responsibility and restoring justice. Through it all, John Matthews remained humble. He did not seek attention for the reversal of the order. He continued his volunteer work, his quiet visits to schools, and his evening walks. But the lesson was clear. Courage, dignity, and honor were not just displayed in medals or titles. They were lived through patience, humility, and respect for others. The judge, too, learned a lesson he would never forget. Authority alone was not enough. Rules must be balanced with compassion, and understanding human values was as important as enforcing the law. In the end, both men had grown, one through the trial of judgment, the other through the quiet strength of integrity. By the time the public learned that the order had been overturned, John Matthews had already returned to his usual routine. But this time, he wore his Medal of Honor freely at events not for himself, but for the countless soldiers whose stories might never be told. The nation, inspired by his calm dignity, had learned a lesson about respect, courage, and the meaning of true honor, one that could not be measured in rules alone. Months had passed since the courtroom incident, but for John Matthews, life had returned to its quiet rhythm. The local town had grown used to seeing him at community events, helping at the Veterans Center and walking through the park with a calm smile. Yet the story of the judge's order and the public outcry had not faded from the minds of many. People still spoke of John Matthews with admiration, remembering how he had faced judgment with patience and dignity. When the official reversal came, it was a quiet announcement, almost understated in its wording. The order restricting John from wearing his Medal of Honor had been lifted. There was no fanfare, no grand ceremony. But to John, it did not need celebration. The medal had never been about recognition for him personally. It had always been about honoring those who could not stand to receive it themselves, the soldiers who had given their lives and the ones whose names had been lost to history. On the first Veterans Day after the reversal, John was invited to a public remembrance ceremony. This time it was different. People lined the streets leading to the park, carrying flags, wearing pins, and holding small banners that read, "Honor lives here and respect earned, never taken." When John arrived, he was greeted with quiet applause. Veterans saluted him, children waved small flags, and families nodded in appreciation. He felt their respect deeply, but he remained humble. John carefully placed his Medal of Honor on his chest. He looked at it, but his eyes were not on the medal itself. He thought of the soldiers it represented, the friends he had served with, the unknown men and women who had made the ultimate sacrifice, and the families who had lived without them. He understood now more clearly than ever that the medal was a symbol of their courage, their dedication, and their love for country. As the ceremony began, John noticed some familiar faces in the crowd. There were the veterans who had supported him from the beginning, the children who had sent letters and drawn pictures, and even people who had never served but had been inspired by his story. He took a deep breath and stepped forward to speak. His voice was calm, steady, and filled with sincerity. "I stand here today," he said, "not for myself but for all those who cannot stand here. This medal is not mine alone. It belongs to the ones who gave everything, and to those who continue to serve with courage and dedication. I wear it so that the world will remember them, and so that we never forget the values that make us stronger, kinder, and more united." The crowd listened in silence. There was no cheering at first, just a deep, thoughtful quiet. Then, one by one, people began to clap, and the sound grew into a respectful applause that echoed through the park. It was not loud or boisterous. It was sincere, heartfelt, and filled with admiration. Many people had tears in their eyes. They were not clapping for John Matthews alone, but for everything he represented: honor, integrity, and the courage to do what is right even when it is difficult. Even Judge Edward Harland, who had once issued the order, attended quietly. He stood at the back of the crowd, watching John with a mixture of humility and reflection. The judge had learned a lesson he would never forget. That authority without understanding could lead to mistakes, and that respect for service and human dignity could not be measured only by rules. For him, seeing John Matthews stand there calm and composed was a powerful reminder of what true honor meant. After the ceremony, many people approached John to speak. Veterans thanked him. Children handed him drawings and letters, and families shared stories of loved ones who had served. John listened carefully, smiling gently at each person. He never raised his voice or boasted about his actions. Instead, he encouraged others to remember the values behind service, courage, and respect. He reminded them that medals were symbols, but it was the actions behind them that truly mattered. That evening, as the sun began to set, John walked quietly through the cemetery where the tomb of the unknown soldier stood. The marble steps reflected the soft orange light, and the air was filled with the calm rustle of leaves. John approached the tomb and stood silently, as he had done so many times before. His shoes were polished, his uniform neat, and his Medal of Honor gleamed in the sunlight. He thought about all the soldiers whose names were unknown, all the heroes who never returned home, and all those who had fought quietly without recognition. He whispered a few words to them, words of gratitude, respect, and remembrance. "I wear this for you," he said softly, "and I will always carry your stories with me." In that moment, John realized something important. The struggle in the courtroom, the public outcry, and the judge's eventual reversal were not just about him. They were about reminding a nation of the meaning of honor, courage, and integrity. They were about showing that even in times of misunderstanding or disagreement, dignity and patience could prevail. And most importantly, they were about keeping the memory of those who sacrificed everything alive. As night fell, John returned home. His neighbors waved as he passed, children waved small flags, and veterans saluted him in quiet respect. He smiled faintly, but he felt no pride. Pride, he knew, was not the goal. The goal was to live in a way that honored those who had given their all, and to remind the world that respect and dignity were worth more than any medal alone. Over the following months, John continued to be a quiet inspiration to his town and to the nation. Schools invited him to speak to students about service and courage, and veterans organizations highlighted his story as an example of patience, humility, and integrity. The story of the courtroom incident became part of history lessons, teaching children that real honor could never be taken by a rule, and that standing for what is right often requires calm courage and unwavering principles. Even Judge Harland, who had once ordered the medal removed, began to quietly advocate for respect toward veterans. He spoke to younger judges about the importance of understanding the deeper meaning behind service and medals. While he had learned his lesson the hard way, he also learned that accountability, reflection, and humility could restore trust and respect. John Matthews, however, remained humble as ever. He did not seek recognition, awards, or accolades. He continued his quiet life, volunteering, mentoring, and visiting memorials. But the impact of his actions extended far beyond his small town. Across the country, people remembered his dignity, patience, and courage. They remembered a man who had faced judgment not with anger but with calm integrity. And they remembered that real honor is measured not by laws alone, but by respect, compassion, and the courage to stand for what is right. On one calm morning, John visited the tomb of the unknown soldier again. The marble steps were cool under his shoes, the air crisp and still. He stood silently, his Medal of Honor on his chest, and looked out over the graves. He could feel the presence of the soldiers he had served with, the unknown heroes and all those who had inspired him. He knew that his story, the courtroom struggle, the public support, and the reversal of the judge's order, was just one chapter in a much larger story of courage, sacrifice, and honor. As he saluted the tomb, John whispered one last message. "Your stories live on. I will carry them with me always." And with that, he turned and walked slowly away, his steps steady, his heart calm, and his spirit strong. The nation had witnessed a story of honor restored, dignity defended, and courage acknowledged. But for John Matthews, the medal was never about fame or recognition. It was, and always would be, a symbol of respect, remembrance, and the enduring power of true honor. In the end, both John and those who had watched his journey learned a timeless lesson. Courage and honor are not taken by rules, authority, or orders. They live in the hearts of those who serve, in the memories of those who sacrifice, and in the actions of those who choose integrity, humility, and dignity above all else.